To his friends, he was the blonde beast. To his enemies, he was the hangman or the butcher of Prague. To the man he devoted his life to, he was the man with the iron heart. During his life, Reinhard Heydrich was known by many names, too numerous to list here, but you probably associate him with one name in particular. Heydrich was the Nazi target of Operation Anthropoid. A talented classical musician who threw it all away to become a military man, Heydrich was the Nazi ideal made flesh. He was tall, he was blonde, cultured, a lover of Wagner. He was also brutal. It was under Heydrich's watch that the infamous Einsatzgruppen were formed, under his direction that Nazi enemies were killed, and his designs that the Holocaust was perpetrated. Assassinated by Czechoslovak resistance in Prague in 1942, Heydrich is a mystery, a sensitive, cultured boy who somehow grew up to be one of history's worst monsters. Join us today as we journey into Prague's heart of darkness. If you were shown the conditions Heydrich was born into and asked what you thought he would grow up to be, genocidal maniac would probably be quite far down your list. Born Reinhard Eugen Tristan Heydrich on March 7, 1904, the world baby Reinhard came into was one of middle-class luxury. His father, Bruno, was an opera aficionado who ran a music conservatory in the German town of Halle near Leipzig, while his mother, Elizabeth, was a pianist from a wealthy family. For young Heydrich, that meant a life of culture, money, and, most importantly, music. Music was the air that this family breathed. Bruno wrote his own operas and sang on stage, while Elizabeth had little Heydrich trained to exacting classical standards on the violin and the cello. But there was a cloud hanging over this family's charmed life, a cloud that only really counts as a cloud if you live surrounded by German nationalists. Everyone in Halle thought that Bruno was Jewish. And you might be thinking now, well, yeah, but so what? Well, Bruno, he didn't feel that way. He was certain his supposed Jewish background was why his opera career never really took off. As time went on, he began to loathe the religion he blamed for his own failings. And he made sure that young Heydrich loathed it too. Still, this unpleasantness aside, their family life, it was relatively normal. Elizabeth was a strict mother, determined her son should succeed, and soon Heydrich was not just an accomplished musician, but also a powerful sportsman. This normal family appearance, it only began to crack in 1914. Like many Germans, the Heydrichs were first excited by World War I's outbreak, thinking it'd be a fairly easy win for their country. But as the first weeks dragged on, and then months, and finally years, that optimism it began to fade. In the winter of 1916 to 1917, fuel and food shortages brought on by that war led to starvation and misery across the nation. In Halle, work at Bruno's conservatory it dried up as the economy faltered. As 1917 rolled on, the German population grew angry at the war's management. They began striking and protesting. Before long, the cities were in turmoil as running street battles erupted between the far-right nationalists and communists. Halle wasn't spared. As a teen, Heydrich watched left and right extremists battle for control of the city's streets. Unlike his terrified parents, Heydrich found the clashes intoxicating. In October of 1918, German dreams of winning the war, they finally collapsed with a resounding crash. Germany removed the Kaiser from power and brought in a civilian government tasked with negotiating peace. In the aftermath, whole segments of the military went into rebellion. Before the war had ended on November the 11th, the country it was in revolution. As a communist uprising seized control of Berlin, Heydrich decided that he had to make a stand. In Halle, the now 16-year-old boy had joined a local Freikorps unit. Intended as an anti-communist militia, the Freikorps soon bloomed into a far-right paramilitary force that targeted Jews and revolutionaries alike. For the teenage Heydrich, the experience it was an eye-opener. For the first time in his life, he was surrounded by people who felt like he did, people who shared his anti-Semitic beliefs and his dislike of communists. They also shared his desire to use violence. By August the 11th, the country it was back under control. The Weimar Republic was founded, and Germany began to adjust to its new life as a democratic nation. But the revolution of 1919, it had unleashed the forces of far-right nationalism, and Heydrich wasn't the only one to heed their siren call. The early days of the Weimar Republic were marked by a never-ending series of political wildfires. On March 13, 1920, an ultra-nationalist putsch captured Berlin and held the city for a few days before the government regained control. 3 years later, another right-wing putsch, this time in Munich, killed 20 people. Its leader, well, that was Adolf Hitler. Now, you might be expecting to hear that Heydrich was in the thick of all of this, cheering on the Nazi Party, but you'd be wrong. After the Freikorps disbanded, Heydrich had hung around in Halle just long enough to get his high school diploma in 1922. Then he'd hightailed it out of his hometown as fast as he could. But he hadn't gone running to the Nazi Party. Heydrich instead had joined the German Navy. By 1922, Weimar Germany was in the grip of hyperinflation. The economy, it was in ruins. Anyone who wanted a roof over their head and 3 square meals a day, well, they joined the military. And Heydrich, he wanted more than that. Now a lad of 18, he was ambitious. He wanted to become an admiral. He still flirted with the far right, maintaining membership of the anti-Semitic Deutscher Schutz- und Trußband. But while most future high-ranking Nazis were passionate true believers who were willing to forego a normal life for their cause, Heydrich, he wasn't like that. He wanted a respectable career with responsibility. When Hitler published Mein Kampf from his jail cell in 1925, Heydrich didn't even bother to read it. By 1928, Heydrich's diligent good work had paid off for him to be promoted to first lieutenant and assigned to Navy intelligence. While he was still taunted for his supposed Jewish roots, the bullying he used to receive for his cultured side, it was long gone. Now a grown man, Heydrich's sensitive qualities, they were no longer a burden. In fact, they made him something of a catch. Throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, Heydrich sowed his wild oats like a man hoping to rival the Quakers in breakfast production. It was during this seductive phase that Heydrich met Lena von Osten. Aged just 19, Lena was everything Heydrich wanted in a woman. She was charming, intelligent, and in awe of him. She was also a fervent National Socialist. By the 1930s, the Nazis, they were well known in Germany, but they weren't yet in charge. When Heydrich first met Lena, he actually made fun of her for being a Nazi, calling the leadership clowns and deriding Goebbels as a cripple. Little did the ambitious sailor know that he was only a few short months away from joining those clowns. In early 1931, Heydrich proposed to Lena. He then forwarded a copy of the engagement announcement to another girl that he was seeing as a way of breaking up with her. But Heydrich's classy methods soon returned to bite his Germanic arse when the girl's father found the announcement and hit the roof. He actually complained to the Navy, and the Navy responded by actually firing Heydrich. On April 30th, 1931, Heydrich, he was discharged. When he got the news, the future butcher of Prague locked himself in his room and he cried like a baby for days on end. When Heydrich finally emerged from his epic cry-a-thon, Linda was basically like, "Man, this is perfect. You could absolutely now get a job with the Nazis. This will be great." At first, Heydrich, he wasn't enthusiastic. His main sticking point was that he didn't think they were good enough career prospects. But Lena kept pushing him, and eventually he joined up, becoming member 544,916. And this was the beginning of a rise towards infamy. At this point, you might be wondering how Heydrich the Lothario sailor became Heydrich the Nazi. The answer is, surprisingly, his grandmother. By the time Heydrich joined the Nazis, his mother and grandmother were already enthusiastic members, and they'd carried their wealth and connections into their new lives. Within a month of Heydrich joining, his grandmother had arranged a private meeting between Heydrich and SS leader Heinrich Himmler. It's got to be said that Himmler wasn't all that happy. The only thing that convinced him to go was that Heydrich's grandmother had inflated her grandkids' connections to naval intelligence, which might be useful to the Nazi Party. When the two met in Munich, Himmler curtly gave Heydrich 20 minutes to outline a counterintelligence operation for the Nazi Party. 20 minutes later, the Black Shirts leader collected his jaw off the floor and offered Heydrich a job. Heydrich had absolutely aced the interview. Despite only ever holding a low position in naval intelligence, he managed to use all of his knowledge to outline an effective strategy. When he had a blank spot in his knowledge, he improvised using the plots of half-remembered spy novels. And surprisingly, this totally worked. Himmler recruited Heydrich into the SD, the SS intelligence branch, right then and there. This was the beginning of a partnership that would eventually leave Europe in utter ruins. Although Himmler is infamous in his own right, he and Heydrich could be seen as a bit of a double act, the Laurel and Hardy of mass murder. During the Night of the Long Knives in 1934, Himmler and Heydrich they worked together to exterminate the power holders in the SA, the Nazi brown shirts. One of those killed was SA leader Ernst Röhm, godfather to Heydrich's own child. In the aftermath, Himmler awarded Heydrich by promoting him to chief of the Gestapo. It was just the first in a series of events that we're going to label Himmler promoting Heydrich like crazy. In June of 1936, for example, Himmler merged the SD, the German criminal police, and the Gestapo into a single unit and gave it to Heydrich. 3 years later, in September 1939, Himmler consolidated every single intelligence operation across the entire Third Reich under Heydrich. The new Reich Security Main Office, RSHA, was so powerful even other Nazis were kept in the dark about its very existence. Not that Heydrich didn't earn his new position. For a guy who once called the Nazis clowns, Heydrich had taken to his new job like a fascist duck to water. In November 1938, he had directly organized the looting and burning of Jewish property known as the Kristallnacht. A year later, in August of 1939, Heydrich had also masterminded the false flag attack on Gelewitz that gave the Nazis a pretext for invading Poland. In fact, many of the most infamous Nazi actions can be traced back to this one opera lover from Halle. After the invasion of Poland in September of 1939, for example, Heydrich was put in charge of the Einsatzgruppen. The Einsatzgruppen were death squads that followed in the wake of invading German armies, mopping up the enemies of the Reich. Their brutality was legendary. In the first 3 months after the occupation of Poland, they murdered 50,000 people. When the Nazis pushed east in 1941, it was even worse. Over 33,000 Jews were killed in just 2 days in Kiev by the Einsatzgruppen. Not that Heydrich's crimes only happened abroad. In 1939, as Germany went to war, Heydrich had instructed his security service to focus on the Reich's internal enemies. In the dying days of that year, officers fanned out across German territory, liquidating gypsies, Freemasons, homosexuals, Jehovah's Witnesses, and intellectuals. Taken together, it was a tsunami of bloodshed, a wave of annihilation unlike anything Europe had seen for generations. And the worst, well, it was yet to come. On November 12, 1938, Reinhard Heydrich reported on the Jewish question to a gathering of Nazis. Referring to Europe's Jews as the Eternal Subhuman, he declared that imprisoning them would not be enough, and that the Reich would have to get rid of them completely. Not 3 months later, Hermann Goering took Heydrich to one side and told him to solve the Jewish problem. At this stage, what Goering meant was a policy of forced immigration and brutal tactics that would chase the Jews out of Germany. But even in early 1939, it was clear that the blonde beast wouldn't stop at emigration. It started after the invasion of Poland. As the Einsatzgruppen were unleashing hell, Heydrich and Adolf Eichmann quietly worked together to have all of Austria's Jews rounded up and deported. Later that year, Heydrich directed the opening of ghettos in Lodz, Krakow, and Warsaw. He ensured conditions within them was so bad that hundreds of thousands would just die of disease. Although extermination was not yet official Reich policy, Heydrich knew what his superiors really wanted to do, and alongside his old buddy Himmler, he set out to ensure that it would happen. In May 1941, Heydrich issued an order forbidding Jews to leave the Reich, claiming a final solution was being prepared. On July 31st that year, the Nazi High Command gave Heydrich its blessing to devise a workable plan for his final solution. It was from these black and twisted roots that the poison fruit of the Holocaust was born. Now, many people were implicit in the Holocaust, not least Heydrich's BFF, Himmler, and we don't want to let them off the hook by making it appear like it was all Heydrich's work alone. That being said, the blonde beast was intimately involved in planning the 20th century's worst genocide. On January 20th, 1942, Heydrich summoned leading Nazis to the Berlin suburb of Wannsee for a conference. Over a 3-course lunch, Heydrich led a genial discussion on his plans to rid Europe of its Jews. His idea was to march all 11 million east, letting them die through starvation and exposure along the way. The survivors would then be interred in labor camps and worked to death, with any that persistently survived finally being exterminated by a hand. When the Wannsee Conference disbanded, the fate of the Reich's Jews had been sealed. The Holocaust was now official Nazi policy, and its chief architect was determined to get started as soon as possible. But Heydrich was not going to live to see his murderous idea made flesh. Vengeance was about to come from a very unlikely source. Reinhard Heydrich wasn't aware of it as he stepped out into the cold Berlin air after the Wannsee conference, but far away, two men were already plotting his murder. Their names were Jan Kubiš and Josef Gabčík. They were former Czechoslovak citizens who'd escaped abroad and been trained by British intelligence. These two men were going to kill the blonde beast. The wheels of fate that would set Heydrich, Kubiš, and Gabčík on a collision course had first began turning nearly 3.5 years earlier. In early October of 1938, the governments of France and Britain had agreed to the German annexation of Czechoslovakia's Sudetenland region. Of course, this turned out to be a case of give the Nazis an inch and they'll take your entire country, and 5 months later, German troops invaded Czechoslovakia. In Slovakia, a Nazi puppet regime was installed, while the area of modern-day Czech Republic became the Protectorate of Bohemia and Moravia under direct German rule. The German invasion of Czechoslovakia wasn't as brutal as later invasions like those of Poland and the USSR. Czech industry was considered too vital to the German war effort to risk disrupting, so the Nazi mass executions of the period usually involved dozens rather than hundreds or thousands of victims. In fact, the Nazis were so comparatively soft-touch in the Protectorate that a healthy resistance movement sprang up, engaging in frequent acts of sabotage. It was this sabotage that brought Heydrich onto the scene. On September 24, 1941, Hitler sacked the former protector of Bohemia and Moravia in a fit of pique at all these insolent Czechs playing Schweik to his glorious Reich. In place of the old guy, Heydrich was called in to whip Prague into shape. Heydrich was not a fan of Czechs. Prior to his posting, had referred to his new subjects as the Czech vermin. On arriving in Prague, he arranged to have 142 people hanged in just 5 days. Was a mission statement, a promise of the blood that would flow through the cobbled streets of Prague if the Czechs did not start playing nice. It was also Heydrich's own death warrant. In London, the Czechoslovak government in exile watched Heydrich take his new posting with a feeling of impotence. Already, the exiled Czechs and Slovaks were unpopular among their British hosts for their apparent unwillingness to take hard action. While the Polish pilots were shooting down German bombers and the French resistance was engaging in life-or-death escapades, the Czechs were seemingly content to just sabotage a few factories. The exiled government needed a piece of concrete heroism that they could show the world to prove that they weren't the weak partners in the fight against Nazi rule. In Heydrich, they found the perfect cause. On October 3, 1941, the exiled Czechoslovak government informed Britain's Special Operations Executive that they were going to assassinate Heydrich. The Brits at that point were pretty much like, wow, you guys are going to do something. That would be great. Thanks. Less than a month later, Slovak warrant officer Josef Gabčík was chosen for the special mission. He was initially joined by Czech soldier Karel Svoboda, but Svoboda injured himself and was replaced by Czech staff sergeant Jan Kubiš. 2 months later, just after Christmas, Kubiš and Gabčík parachuted alongside several Czechoslovak commandos into the wintry landscape outside Prague under the cover of night. As the men moved silently through the snow towards the distant glow of the ancient city, the citizens of Bohemia, they slept soundly in their beds. No one could have known the firestorm that was about to be unleashed. The name chosen for the plan to assassinate Heydrich was Operation Anthropoid, a word which means resembling a human. It was the perfect name for a plan to assassinate the most inhuman human of all. Back in Prague, Heydrich had spent his few short months as protector, pacifying first the city and then the country. The capital had seen the promised bloodshed, with some 400 civilians being sent to the gallows. In the wider protectorate, around 5,000 had been imprisoned and tortured. But Heydrich hadn't just gone in guns blazing and noose swinging. It was widely accepted that treating the Czechs like the Poles would hamper the German war effort. So he had deployed kindness as well. Under Heydrich, rations had been increased, wages had been raised, and pensions subsidized. It was a cynical move straight out of the far-right playbook: stuff gold down populations' throats to distract them from your crimes. And it also worked. As spring 1942 rolled into view, Heydrich was able to report the Czechs were pacified. His carrot and machine gun tactics had seen sabotage rates plummet, factory productivity, it was booming. Nazi occupation seemed so accepted that Heydrich even felt comfortable motoring around Prague in an open-topped car with only a handgun and his armed driver for protection. But Prague, it wasn't quite as pacified as Heydrich thought. Somewhere in the old alleyways of the city, Kubiš and Gabčík laid low in the house of an unsuspecting family, plotting their next move. They'd made contact with the Czech resistance months ago and were now feeling deeply frustrated. A plan to assassinate Heydrich on a road near his house had been called off at the last minute. Another plan to kill him on a train had also been aborted. They'd now been in Prague for nearly 5 months, and Heydrich, he was still alive. It was at this point that someone suggested killing Heydrich on his morning drive to work. On Heydrich's regular route, there was a hairpin corner. Anyone driving around it would have to slow to a near crawl. In other words, it was the perfect place to kill someone in an open-topped car. On the morning of May the 27th, 1942, Gabčík and Kubiš awaited in a tram stop by the corner. They were dressed in civilian clothes, but there was nothing innocent about them. Under his coat, Gabčík had a Sten gun, while Kubiš had an anti-tank grenade hidden in his briefcase. As the city came to life around them, the two men waited for their date with destiny. Shortly after they arrived, Heydrich's car came into view. As predicted, the driver slowed down for the corner. Gabčík casually stepped into the street, turned, and opened fire with his submachine gun. At least, that was the plan. What really happened was that Gabčík's gun jammed. As he tried frantically to fire the fatal shot, Heydrich's expression turned from one of surprise to white-hot anger. Ordering his driver to stop, Heydrich grabbed his own gun and raised it at Gabčík. The Slovak just had time to see the barrel train on him when the explosion hit. The second Heydrich's car had stopped, Kubiš had hurled his briefcase bomb. It was actually off target. The grenade exploded behind the car, knocking all three men down, but killing no one. Heydrich staggered to his feet and opened fire on Kubiš, but the blast had stunned him and the bullets went wild. Kubiš grabbed a bicycle and escaped, certain that the assassination had failed. Screaming at his drive to get that bastard, Heydrich ran after Gabčík, firing at the Slovak sprinting form. They ran one street, and then two, when something odd happened. Heydrich, the consummate sportsman, found that he couldn't run. He was out of breath. After a couple of 100 meters, he collapsed on the ground, raised a hand to his side, came away sticky with blood. The briefcase bomb, it had missed its target, but the shrapnel, it had not. The rear of the car was torn to bits. A lump of jagged metal had been propelled deep inside of Heydrich's body. The blonde beast didn't know it, but he was already dead. In the end, it took Reinhard Heydrich 8 whole days to die. For a while, it actually looked as if he might recover, but then septicemia set in and the cultured young man from Halle passed away on June the 4th. The response, it was immediate. In Berlin, Hitler demanded the heads of 10,000 Czechs. On June the 10th, SS units walked into the Czech village of Lidice and fulfilled the Führer's demand. All the men and boys of Lidice were shot dead, and all the women and girls were loaded into trucks and sent to concentration camps. When it was discovered 11 men were outside of the village on business, Nazi agents were sent to track them down and murder them too. All of the pets and animals in the village, they were rounded up and shot. Finally, the buildings were set on fire. The Nazis filmed the whole thing, intending Lidice to be a warning to the world. In Prague, revenge mass killings were carried out, resulting in 1,300 dead. Another Czech village, Ležáky, was targeted and also destroyed. It was like the angel of death had swept across the land, like Heydrich's poisonous soul was carrying out one last killing spree before returning to hell. 3 weeks after the assassination, a Czech collaborator, Karel Čerda, passed on the hiding place of Gabčík and Kubiš to the Gestapo. The two assassins were in the basement of Prague's Cathedral of St. Cyril and Methodius. On June the 18th, 1942, 700 soldiers converged on the church. Gabčík and Kubiš held them off for some hours before committing suicide in the cathedral crypt. The bullet holes from the firefight, they can still be seen to this very day. In the West, the reaction to Heydrich's assassination was equally swift and decisive. The image of Lidice in flames spurred the Allies to tear up the Munich Agreement. Until this moment, in 1942, it was still possible that a post-war settlement might allow the Germans to keep the Sudetenland. With the images of Lidice fresh in everyone's minds, that was simply no longer an option. It was thanks to this one assassination that Czechoslovakia was able to remain a nation after World War II. But what about Heydrich? Heydrich was the only high-ranking Nazi to be assassinated in the whole of World War II, a fact that explains our continued fascination with him. But beyond Operation Anthropoid, Heydrich deserves to be remembered. He was the man who outlined the blueprint for the Holocaust, the man who controlled the infamous Einsatzgruppen. It was under his watch that the notorious Polish ghettos were created. Had he lived longer, it's undoubtable that he would have committed more atrocities. Unlike every other leading Nazi, there's no indication Heydrich was a true believer in the early days, more an opportunist who took a job to please his fiancée and then did that job with bloodthirsty relish. In many ways, that makes him even scarier than someone like his old buddy Himmler. We like to think of people as either inherently good or inherently evil, but Heydrich, he wasn't inherently anything. He was just a blank, hollow man. In another life, he would probably have made a boringly average naval commander. But Heydrich, he didn't live another life. He lived this one, with all its bloodshed. In the end, perhaps all we can say is that the shy, sensitive boy from Halle was simply the perfect anthropoid, a creature that looked human without ever feeling the faintest flicker of humanity. So I'm just going to end it there. No asking for likes or subscribes, stuff like that. Just I hope you found this video informative, and I'll see you next time.